Hey, welcome back to Evolution Part 2. Well, Part B. It's going to be just as exciting as Evolution A, which I hope you've already watched. So, this is basically Part 2 of the lecture. Okay, so we're going to focus more on Darwin and evolution of organisms, just giving a brief, mostly historical context for evolution. Okay, so when it came to how the ancients thought about living organisms, we could talk about that for a long time. I mean, lots of different cultures, different people groups throughout different times had different ideas about where animals and people came from. But I'm just going to start with the Greeks and specifically with Aristotle. So Aristotle helped formulate this idea of the great chain of being, or scala natura. And this idea was modified over time and adopted by Christians a few centuries after Aristotle came up with this. But the premise remained the same. The premise is that when God created everything on earth, he did so in a way that created a hierarchy. All right. And so this hierarchy, or this chain of beings, links everything that we see around us, and it links it according to value and worth. All right. So in other words, if you look, let's start from the top and work our way down. So at the top of the great chain of being, of course, is God. And so again, this is going to be more of a Christian perspective of this idea. And this God of the Bible is over a lot of created spiritual beings, cherubim and angels and so on. So they're a little bit lower than God, but they're higher than people. So the next tier you see there is human beings. And so with human beings, they exhibit this level of importance that's above the animals, but below the angels and below God. And if you'll notice, the human beings themselves have a hierarchy. So your elite or your noble men are at the top, your kings and rulers, and then your upper classes, and then peasants will be below. So it establishes that there's a hierarchy within human culture that is basically ordained by God. Below humans are livestock, right? Cattle and horses and oxen and so on. And below them are the wild animals. And you could break each of these tiers up into a hierarchy. So the wild animals, some might be more valuable or more important than others. So a bear might be more important than a mouse. And below the wild animals, then you have fish and aquatic critters. Below that is plants, and then fungi, and then rocks, minerals, and dirt. So stuff that's not even alive. And fungi above them. So and fungi are, the ancients really didn't even know what the heck a mushroom was. So the great chain of being basically said God created everything in these tiers, and you're basically assigned to whatever level you were created at. So in other words, if you were created a fish, then your place is somewhere in between the wild animals and the plants. And as a fish, you can't really do much about that. That's how God created you. You can't move up, you can't move down, you can't change. It's just the great chain of being is a way of organizing organisms in the natural world. And Christians have viewed organisms under the assumption that they were created in the beginning. So in Genesis 1, we have God creating the earth and everything in it in 6 days. And the thought, and then he creates, and on the sixth day he creates Adam and Eve, and he places them in a garden, and Adam names the garden, and so on. I'm sure you're familiar with that story, and we'll come back to it later this semester. But the idea is that if you were Adam, or you were next to Adam, and you were looking out at these animals he's naming, and you were eating fruit from the trees, and you were walking through the grove, that the plants and the animals and the insects that you would see would be more or less the same ones that we see now. So here, even in this painting, you can see that the animals that surround Adam and Eve in the garden include animals that we recognize: horses and an ostrich and a tiger, and what is that, a dog at Eve's feet? That little white thing? Is that a seal? Um, Deer. Man, I need to put my glasses on. I can't. Anyway, you get my point. The idea is that the animals are more or less unchanged since they were first created. And then later Christian theologians really expanded on this idea of the fall after St. Augustine. And in time, they got a little bit more sophisticated and said, well, maybe the animals can change after the fall. You know, maybe they were all plant eaters in the beginning and then became carnivores. But the point would be that the animals and humans, especially, haven't really changed since God created them in the beginning. All right, let's fast forward to Lamarck. So, Lamarck, why do I have it in bullet points? Come on. Come on. Oh, hey. So, Lamarck, 18th century Frenchman, and looking at fossils and studying animals and plants and so on, he says, you know what? I don't think that animals are the same as they've always been. In other words, he recognized that animals can change over time. And so his main quest was to figure out why they change and how they change. And so his idea was that organisms can change during their lifetimes as they interact with or are influenced by the environment. And then as an organism changes in its lifetime, it'll pass those changes on to its offspring. And then those offspring can likewise be changed by and influenced by the environment, and they can change and they can pass those changes on to their offspring. So the idea is that organisms can change both within their lifetime and from generation to generation. And the classic example here is giraffes. This is, you've probably heard this before, would be my guess. It's pretty well known. So the idea is you begin with the question, how does a giraffe, how did it get a long neck? Did God create it in the beginning? Has it always had a long neck, or did it maybe grow a long neck over time? And Lamarck said that the giraffe didn't always have a long neck. So at one point in time, giraffes probably had a shorter neck, and then giraffes stretched out and stretched out their necks in order to eat leaves that are on the tree branches that are a little bit higher. And so for giraffes that did this, they stretched their neck and it got longer. So this would be equivalent to, a weightlifter pumping iron, lifting weights, and they get bigger muscles. So it recognizes that the phenotype of an organism does have the potential to change over time. All right, and so the giraffes that stretched out their necks, they gave birth to little cute baby giraffes, and those babies had slightly longer necks, and those slightly longer neck giraffes grew up to adult giraffes, and they stretched their neck to get even higher leaves, and their neck stretched, and they had babies that had slightly longer necks, and so on and so forth. So the necks progressively got longer over many generations. Right? And so this is interesting because if you go back to the idea that we talked about on the last slide with the great chain of being, right? People were thinking that humans and animals maintained their place, their God-ordained place in a hierarchy. And Lamarck is saying that organisms can move up or down this hierarchy based on how they improve themselves. So a giraffe can more or less become a better giraffe. It can improve as a giraffe by stretching its neck out. And as a side note, this is interesting because Lamarck is alive in France during the French Revolution. If you remember anything about the French Revolution, basically you've got a hierarchy set up with the king and queen and rulers at the top and peasants at the bottom. And during the French Revolution, right, this hierarchy was overthrown and the peasants were guillotining the heads off of the ruling class. And so this idea of change and of kind of moving up and down this chain of being was very much in the air, and it probably helped influence Lamarck's ideas. So was Lamarck right or wrong? Well, he was right in that animals change, and he was right in that changes can get passed on to offspring, and he was even right in that the environment will help shape and influence what it means to be a successful organism in that environment. However, he was wrong about inheritance. So, and we can't blame him for this. I mean, this is, half a century before Mendel. Half a century? Well, about that. And so he didn't know anything about genes or, he wasn't doing Punnett squares like you guys were. So he was wrong in the sense that these changes can't really get passed on. So the example on the slide is if a bodybuilder pumps iron and gets huge muscles, they look like The Rock. If you've seen pictures of The Rock's kids aren't ripped. They don't have huge muscles. That'd be kind of weird to have a little infant that's got huge biceps. And so sometimes organisms change in their lifetime, but those changes don't necessarily get passed on. All right, but the point is, right, it's not important that Lamarck was wrong. What's important is he did get some things right. And what's, I guess, the most important thing is that Lamarck was one of the first to really popularize or help spread this idea that was slowly growing among biologists, that organisms change in time. And Lamarck was simply looking for a mechanism that would cause these changes. All right, so that leads us to Darwin. And man, I'm skipping so much stuff, but Darwin is born in 1809, so he overlaps with Lamarck. And he's born to a wealthy family, and so he had a lot of money, and that meant he didn't ever really have to have a day job. So Darwin was interested in a lot of things, and he spent almost all of his free time going out into nature and collecting stuff and making studies. He studied earthworms and barnacles and later birds, and he just insects. He had a really wide perspective on the world, right? And he was also alive at a time when people had the boat technology to go on long ocean voyages. And this is also a few centuries after Christopher Columbus, so they're aware of the New World. And so as a young man, Darwin has the opportunity to go on a boat ride. So he hitches a free ride on a boat called the Beagle. And the Beagle was tasked with sailing around the world, so circumnavigating the world. And their job was to map coastlines. And so, as you can see from the picture, on the voyage of this boat, basically they would just hop from port to port and sail along the coastline, and they would map it and take measurements. And while they were doing this, or while the crew was working hard and restocking the boat, Darwin would go off on these excursions. So Darwin gets a really interesting perspective that not a lot of people had. He was able to see the animals and the plants of South America and Australia and so on. Animals and plants that looked a lot different from the plants that he was used to seeing in England. And what was especially important was that he saw a lot of islands. So he saw plants and animals that lived on islands. And what he realized really quickly was that plants and animals on these distant continents and on these isolated islands, they tend to be unique. So you get species that only exist on those islands. So the Galapagos, which we'll talk about more in a minute, are a good example of this. And Australia, the island continent, as you know, has a lot of weird animals, like kangaroos and the platypus, the platypi. And so Darwin saw all this. And meanwhile, he was reading Lyell, who, if you remember from the last lecture, argued that the earth was really old and that the earth gradually changes. And so Darwin was like, well, maybe animals have been around for a really long time and maybe they gradually change. And he read a lot of books, and he was also influenced by Thomas Malthus, who was another Englishman. And Malthus was basically arguing that at the time that the human population was growing really quickly, but the ability to produce food was not growing as quickly. So human populations were growing mostly exponentially, and food supplies were growing more linearly. And so Malthus was saying, look, when the population outstrips the food supply, it's going to lead to conflict. So we're going to have wars over food, and basically whenever limited but necessary resources like food are in short supply, there's competition for them. And so who's going to get food? Well, the ones that can fight or mount an army or have access to more food or whatever. And so Darwin read those ideas and basically applied it to animals. And so just to use an example that's common in biology textbooks, we'll talk about Darwin's finches. So on the Galapagos Islands, so it's a series of several islands of different sizes, with different food sources. And on these islands, you had unique species of birds on the various islands. right, including different species of finches. And so he found that some finches had thick bills and some finches had slender bills. And so why would that be? In other words, did God create some of these back, Adam and Eve time? Did God create some of them with thick bills, or did he created some with thin bills? Or maybe somehow a mechanism changed these finches. So Darwin said, maybe there was one species of finch that landed on this island, and as they competed for limited food, right, the ones that couldn't get food died, and the ones that could get food did. And maybe some of these birds started eating food that required thick bills, so over time their bills got thicker, and other finches started eating food that required slender bills, so their bills got smaller. All right, and he also saw modern armadillos. Are you familiar with armadillos? Anybody from the South? Anybody? Yeah, you can't answer me back. I'm recording this. If you've ever seen armadillos in the American South, they're from South America. You can see a picture of one there. Kind of funny looking little critters. And Darwin saw fossils of this glyptodont, this ancient armadillo. I don't know if you can read that. These ancient armadillos. And you can tell superficially they look really similar. Now, just to give you a sense of scale, a modern armadillo is the size of a large football. I mean, footballs basically come in one size, but imagine if you had a large, extra large football. The glyptodont was the size of a Volkswagen Bug, so like more car size. So they're huge. You could put a saddle on one and ride it, which would be awesome. And Darwin said, did God create, or he thought to himself, did God create these little armadillos and these big glyptodonts? Or maybe these glyptodont fossils represent an animal that was alive a long time ago, and the modern armadillos are their descendants. So maybe over time, species change, right? And so this would be common descent. This would mean that just like armadillos descended from a glyptodont ancestor, and just like the thick and thin-billed finches descended from, I don't know, a medium-billed finch a long time ago, maybe that's true for all animals. Maybe the glyptodont evolved from something else, and maybe the finch evolved from something else, which evolved from something else, and so on and so forth. And so maybe all species share common ancestry. Maybe animal life began with a few species of some simple critter, and over time it diversified into all the species that we see now. And to go back to the Great Chain of Being, this is interesting because Lamarck kind of changed the way that people viewed the chain of being by hypothesizing that animals can move up or down. And Darwin is basically saying there is no chain of being. There's a tree of being. There's an evolutionary tree. So it's more like tracing speciation is more like tracing, lineage through a family tree. Darwin also thought about dogs and pigeons. We don't talk about pigeons as much. Apparently, people were into breeding pigeons when Darwin was around. It was a hot topic. But dogs you're probably more familiar with. So in the picture, you can see all these species of dog, not species, all these different varieties or breeds of dogs. So you got big dogs and small dogs, mean dogs and nice dogs, fun dogs and annoying dogs. You've got dogs with different color patterns and long legs and short legs and so on and so forth. So how do we get all these breeds of dogs? Well, humans selected what traits they wanted. So to get a Labrador Retriever, for example, they would breed dogs that were good at fetching ducks that they had shot and bringing them back and brought them back. Or terriers were good at hunting small game, or beagles were good at tracking game through the woods. And so humans practiced artificial selection. That is, they selected what traits that they wanted in the dogs, and they bred the dogs accordingly. So dogs have been shaped by human choice. And so Darwin said maybe that happens. Oh, hold up. And so we've done that with plants too. Just the bottom picture, which is probably half cut off on your image. Broccoli, cabbage, kale, cauliflower, those are all the same plant. So humans also bred a species of wild mustard into all these different, mostly disgusting vegetables. And so Darwin said, maybe this happens naturally too. So we have artificial selection where humans are selecting traits that are desirable. Well, what about natural selection? Maybe the environment selects which traits are beneficial and which ones are not beneficial. And ones that are beneficial, those individuals survive and reproduce and pass those traits on to offspring. So maybe the environment is shaping the traits and the behaviors of different species. And so Darwin spent a long time writing this book, right? He was analyzing the samples he collected on the beagle, and he was going to write this huge book that basically set forward his ideas. And he was pretty leisurely. He was and pretty methodical. He was writing over a long period of time, and then one day he got in the mail, not an email, like an old school mail letter. He got one from a dude named Alfred Wallace. So Wallace was familiar with Darwin, and he wrote this just cordial letter to Darwin and said, "Hey, Charles, hey, Mr. Darwin," I don't know what he called him, and said, I'm observing these animals, and he was over in the South Pacific, and he said, I think that maybe the environment shapes animals, organisms over time, and maybe they pass beneficial traits on their offspring. So basically, he had kind of a rough draft of Darwin's same ideas. So in science, you only get credit for an idea if you're the first to put it forth by publishing. And so Darwin quickly published a paper, or had a paper read, um, and basically was able to put together his ideas and published his book in 1859. And the book was called On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection. And actually, the title's a little bit longer than that, but that's good enough for us. And so the main idea of this book is that natural selection is the mechanism that changes organisms in time. In other words, people understood that organisms change, and Darwin's providing an explanation of how they change. And that explanation is primarily natural selection. So what is natural selection? So Darwin said it's got 4 parts. So first, every organism produces more offspring than can possibly survive. So a sea turtle lays, I don't know how many eggs, and those eggs hatch, a proportion of them hatch, and then of those that hatch, a proportion of them make it to the sea, and a proportion of the ones that make it to the sea survive to adulthood and have offspring themselves. So the bulk of offspring that are produced die, all right? And so why do some live and some die? So Darwin said there's a struggle for existence. So those sea turtles must compete for limited resources. There's only so much food to go around, right? And so they have to avoid predators. And so the offspring have to struggle in order to survive. And therefore, the sea turtles that have traits that help them survive, maybe they're better swimmers, or they're a little smarter, or they're bigger, or whatever, those are the sea turtles that can get resources and can survive and can reproduce. So this means there's survival and reproduction of the fittest. In other words, fittest doesn't mean strongest or fastest necessarily. It just means the ones that are best adapted to their environment. So a sloth is really slow, and that's good for the sloth. And a cheetah is really fast, and that's good for the cheetah. So organisms are shaped in different ways, leading some to be large and some to be small, and some to be smart and some to be dumb, and some to be slow and some to be fast. The point is that natural selection shapes organisms so that they can maximize their survival and reproduction. Oh, so here, I was going to try to do this. Oh, whoops, that's me practicing. Oop. Oh, delete, sorry. Okay, so what if let's say there's an oak tree and it makes a bunch of acorns, right? So, bunch of acorns. So you can see some are big and some are small. So here's your acorns. Now we know that not all these acorns are going to survive, right? So some might not be able to put down roots, or some might get eaten by a squirrel or whatever. And the point is, over time, maybe some of these acorns die. And in this case, let's say it's the smaller ones that die. So the smaller ones died because maybe they didn't have big enough root systems or enough nutrients to get going. So these bigger ones survive. And so these bigger ones end up having babies, right, of different sizes, having babies, making acorns of different sizes. And then over time, some of those die and some of them survive. And so over time, maybe the acorns get bigger. I don't know. That was kind of a goofy example. I was really just trying to show off my little whiteboard. Oh. Huh? Yeah? That is creepy. Hey-oh. Give him some ears here. Give him... Whoa. Okay. All right, let's go back. Let's go back to this is more under my control. All right, and so Darwin published his book, I mentioned in 1859, and it was a bestseller. So he published a bunch of copies. But I wanted to point out one thing. One thing that's kind of interesting is in the first edition, 1859, his concluding paragraph said, "There is grandeur in this view of life, that is, natural selection as a mechanism of evolution, with its several powers having been originally breathed into a few forms or into one." So in other words, this idea that maybe life was given a jump start by life being breathed into it. So you can get the feel that he's alluding to the story in Genesis, but it's pretty vague. And so in later editions, he changed it to this, having been originally breathed by the Creator. Now that might not seem like a big deal, but I think it is, because Darwin here is basically paying homage to the Christian Europe. He's basically saying, look, what I'm promoting here isn't necessarily against God or against the Bible, right? Maybe God got this thing started. I mean, he alludes to maybe God could, maybe God could have not divided it. Maybe God could have overseen it. But the point is, in later editions, Darwin is kind of trying to appeal to his audience in a little bit more of a specific way. Darwin's personal views on God kind of changed throughout his life, and I don't really have time to get into it now, but at one point he was studying to be a priest, but by the time that he was older, his daughter had died, and basically he had become more or less agnostic. But anyway, my point here is he didn't come up with the idea of evolution to try to get rid of God or disprove God. He was trying to explain why animals change in time and why we see weird animals on islands and why we see fossils that are similar to modern animals. All right, so his ideas have been built upon and expanded. And so if we're looking at a Darwinian model of evolution, and there's lots of different models of evolution, but if we go with one that is true to most of Darwin's original arguments, we can break it up into 4 points. So one, there's a history of life. In other words, all organisms share a common ancestor. So a finch and an armadillo and an orangutan and even a human have all evolved from some common ancestor, a simpler, ancient common ancestor. So diversity and complexity increase over time, generally, as evolution occurs. All right, number two, now Darwin didn't put this forth because he didn't know about it, but later the idea of mutations being a source of new genetic information became an important part of Darwinian evolution, and I'll return to that in future lectures. Number three, natural selection is the primary mechanism of evolutionary change. So Darwinian evolution focuses on natural selection as the main mechanism. That doesn't mean that there's not other mechanisms. We'll talk about some other mechanisms of evolutionary change later on, but the point is natural selection is really important. And fourth, gradualism. So this idea that species change more or less gradually in time. I mean, maybe sometimes there can be spurts where an animal changes or a plant changes really quickly, but generally speaking, it's slow and gradual and therefore over a long period of time. All right, so wrapping up evolution A and evolution B, the modern view is that everything evolves, not in the biological sense, but in the general sense of evolution. In other words, everything changes. So the universe has changed a lot since the Big Bang, the last 13.8 billion years. Earth was formed when our solar system formed about 4.5 billion years ago. Life arose, first as simple life and then evolving into more complex life over the last 3.5 billion years or so. And then Homo sapiens show up relatively late on this time scale, with the earliest Homo sapiens fossils showing up around 200,000 years ago. And we'll return to all this in more detail, but that's kind of the big picture that summarizes this chapter.